The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as tourists began gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Emma and Jake, two young backpackers from Australia who had saved for months to experience London's royal traditions firsthand. Their excitement was infectious as they pushed through the growing crowd, cameras ready to capture every moment of the famous spectacle. Emma clutched her worn guidebook tightly, pointing out various landmarks to Jake as they navigated the sea of people. At 22, she possessed an adventurous spirit that had led them on this European journey, while Jake, her childhood friend and travel companion, carried their heavy backpack filled with souvenirs and snacks. They had been exploring Europe for 3 weeks, staying in budget hostels and eating cheap street food, but this moment felt special, a chance to witness something truly royal and majestic. The couple had arrived extra early, hoping to secure the perfect viewing spot near the palace gates. Their research had paid off as they managed to claim a position just behind the barrier ropes, close enough to see the intricate details of the guards' uniforms and hear the crisp commands echoing across the courtyard. Emma bounced on her toes with anticipation, her blonde hair catching the morning light as she adjusted her camera settings for what she hoped would be the perfect shot. As the ceremony began, the iconic red uniform guards marched with military precision across the courtyard. Their tall black bearskin hats swayed slightly with each synchronized step, and their polished boots created a rhythmic beat against the ancient stones. The tourists fell silent, mesmerized by the display of tradition that had remained unchanged for centuries. Emma and Jake exchanged excited glances, both feeling privileged to witness this piece of living history. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation as more guards appeared, their brass buttons gleaming in the sunlight. Each movement was calculated and precise, a testament to months of rigorous training and dedication to upholding royal traditions. The crowd pressed forward slightly, everyone wanting to capture the perfect photograph or video to share with friends and family back home. Emma raised her camera, adjusting the zoom to focus on one particular guard whose stoic expression and perfect posture made him an ideal subject. Through her lens, she could see the intricate details of his uniform, the golden threads woven into the red fabric, the perfectly aligned buttons, and the immaculate condition of every element of his attire. This guard, whom she would later learn was named Sergeant William Hayes, had served the royal family for over 8 years and took immense pride in maintaining the highest standards of appearance and conduct. Jake pulled out his phone to record a video, wanting to capture not just the visual spectacle, but also the sounds of the ceremony, the bark of commands, the shuffle of feet, and the occasional tourist's whispered commentary. He had promised his younger sister back in Melbourne that he would document every moment of their London adventure, and this ceremony was definitely the highlight so far. The guards continued their routine with mechanical precision, their faces betraying no emotion, despite the hundreds of camera flashes going off around them. This stoic composure was part of their training. They were taught to remain completely focused on their duties regardless of external distractions. For Sergeant Hayes, this meant ignoring the constant chatter of tourists, the clicking of cameras, and even the occasional attempt by visitors to make him laugh or break character. As the ceremony progressed, Emma became increasingly absorbed in capturing the perfect shot. She leaned forward slightly, trying to get a better angle over the heads of other tourists. Her backpack, loosely secured and bulging with souvenirs from their travels, began to shift with her movements. The bag contained everything from miniature Big Ben replicas to packets of English tea, all carefully collected as mementos of their European adventure. Jake, meanwhile, was completely focused on his video recording, panning slowly across the formation of guards to capture the full scope of the ceremony. He had borrowed a professional camera from a friend back home and was determined to create something worthy of a travel documentary. The morning light was perfect, and the guards' uniforms seemed to glow with an almost ethereal quality in the golden sunshine. Neither Emma nor Jake noticed the subtle shift in Emma's backpack as she continued to lean forward and adjust her position for better photographs. The bag's main zipper, worn from weeks of constant use and stuffed beyond capacity, had begun to strain against the pressure of its contents. The couple was completely absorbed in the magnificent display before them, unaware that their innocent enthusiasm was about to create an unforgettable moment. The crowd around them continued to grow, with late arrivals pushing gently from behind to get their own glimpse of the ceremony. This added pressure caused Emma to lean even further forward, her backpack now hanging precariously from one shoulder. The worn fabric creaked softly, a sound lost in the general murmur of the crowd and the commanding voices of the officers directing the guard formations. Sergeant Hayes maintained his position with unwavering focus, his eyes fixed straight ahead as he had been trained to do. Years of experience had taught him to remain completely still and composed regardless of what was happening around him. He had weathered everything from sudden downpours to overly enthusiastic tourists trying to pose with him for photographs. Nothing could break his concentration or professional demeanor. The morning continued to unfold beautifully, with the ceremony proceeding exactly as it had countless times before. The guards moved through their choreographed routine with the precision of a well-oiled machine, each man playing his part in maintaining a tradition that stretched back through generations of British royal history. For Emma and Jake, this was the adventure of a lifetime, a moment they would treasure forever. Little did they know that in just a few minutes, their London experience would take an unexpected turn that would leave them both embarrassed and amazed, creating a memory far more vivid than any photograph could capture. The disaster struck without warning during the most solemn moment of the ceremony. As Emma stretched forward to capture the perfect close-up shot of the lead guard, the overstressed zipper on her backpack finally gave way with a sharp, ripping sound. The contents exploded outward like confetti, creating a chaotic shower of souvenirs, snacks, and personal belongings that scattered across the pristine courtyard. A bottle of water bounced off the cobblestones and rolled directly into the path of the marching guards. Packets of biscuits burst open, sending crumbs flying in all directions. Her collection of miniature London landmarks clattered across the ancient stones, creating an obstacle course that would challenge even the most disciplined military formation. The disaster seemed to unfold in slow motion as Emma watched in horror, her face turning crimson with embarrassment. But the most catastrophic item to emerge from the bag was a large cup of coffee she had purchased from a nearby vendor just minutes before the ceremony began. The lidded cup had been nestled securely in the top compartment of her backpack, but now it sailed through the air in a perfect arc, its trajectory aimed directly at Sergeant William Hayes, who stood motionless at his post just a few feet away. The coffee cup struck the sergeant's pristine red tunic with a wet, splashing sound that seemed to echo across the suddenly silent courtyard. The dark liquid spread across the scarlet fabric like spilled ink on paper, creating an enormous stain that covered nearly the entire front of his uniform. Steam rose from the wet fabric as the coffee soaked through multiple layers of his ceremonial dress, the brown liquid contrasting sharply with the bright red wool. The crowd gasped collectively, and several tourists instinctively stepped back as if they themselves had been splashed. Cameras stopped clicking, conversations ceased mid-sentence, and even the other guards seemed to pause momentarily in their routine, though their training prevented them from breaking formation completely. The only sounds were Emma's horrified gasp and the gentle dripping of coffee onto the cobblestones below. Jake stood frozen beside his girlfriend, his camera still recording everything, but his mouth hanging open in disbelief. He had witnessed the entire disaster unfold but felt powerless to stop it. The coffee had been meant to keep Emma alert during their early morning adventure, but now it had created what appeared to be an international incident involving the British Royal Guard. Emma's mind raced as she stared at the damage she had caused. The guard's uniform, which moments before had been a perfect example of military precision and royal tradition, now looked like the victim of a food fight. The coffee had not only stained the fabric, but it also splashed onto his white crossbelt and even reached the brass buttons, dulling their shine with droplets of the dark liquid. Tears began to well up in Emma's eyes as the full magnitude of the situation hit her. She had potentially ruined a ceremony that was watched by thousands of tourists and broadcast around the world. The uniform that now bore her coffee stain represented centuries of tradition and military honor, and she had destroyed it with her clumsiness and poorly packed backpack. The other tourists began to murmur among themselves, some pointing at Emma, while others shook their heads in disapproval. A few people started taking pictures of the scene, turning Emma and Jake into unwilling participants in what would likely become a viral social media moment. The young couple felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon them, judging them for their carelessness and disrespect. Sergeant Hayes remained perfectly still throughout the entire incident, his training preventing him from reacting to the chaos that had just engulfed him. Coffee dripped steadily from his uniform onto his polished boots, but his expression never changed. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, and his posture stayed rigid and professional, despite the liquid slowly soaking through his clothing to his skin underneath. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity to Emma and Jake, though in reality it was only a few seconds. The other guards continued their ceremony as if nothing had happened, their discipline and training overriding any natural instinct to react to the unusual situation. The military precision of the event continued, but everyone present knew that something unprecedented had just occurred. Emma finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. She wanted to apologize, to somehow undo what had happened, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. How could she possibly make amends for such a public disaster? The guard was still on duty, still maintaining his post despite being soaked in coffee, and she had no idea what the proper protocol was for such a situation. Jake reached over and gently touched Emma's arm, trying to offer some comfort, while also grappling with his own embarrassment. They were representing not just themselves but their entire country, and this incident would likely be remembered as a perfect example of tourist behavior gone wrong. The thought of calling their families back home to explain what had happened made both of them feel even worse. The coffee continued to drip steadily from the sergeant's uniform, creating a small puddle at his feet that reflected the morning sunlight. His black boots, which had been polished to mirror-like perfection just hours earlier, now bore spots and streaks of the dark liquid. The damage seemed to grow worse with each passing second as the coffee spread further into the fabric and leather. Palace security officers began to take notice of the commotion, their attention drawn by the unusual disturbance in what was typically a well-orchestrated and peaceful ceremony. Emma could see them beginning to move in their direction, and her heart rate increased as she realized that this situation was far from over. What had started as an innocent attempt to capture beautiful photographs was rapidly becoming a nightmare that would follow them for years to come. The moments following the coffee disaster felt like hours to Emma and Jake as they stood paralyzed with embarrassment and fear. The ceremony continued around them, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Tourists who had been focused on the guards were now staring at the young couple, some with sympathetic expressions while others showed clear disapproval of what they perceived as disrespectful behavior. Emma's hands shook as she bent down to frantically collect the scattered contents of her backpack. Miniature Big Ben replicas, packets of tea, postcards, and various souvenirs lay scattered across the historical cobblestones like the aftermath of a small explosion. Each item she retrieved felt heavier than it should, weighted down by her overwhelming shame and the dozens of eyes watching her every movement. Jake joined her on the ground, helping to gather their belongings while trying to shield her from the curious stares and camera phones that had turned their way. He could hear whispered conversations in multiple languages, and though he couldn't understand all the words, the tone was universally critical. Some tourists were already posting about the incident on social media, and Jake knew that by evening, their embarrassing moment would be circulating globally. The palace security officers approached with measured steps, their professional demeanor making it impossible to guess their intentions. Emma's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Would they be arrested for disrupting a royal ceremony? Would they be banned from the UK? Would this incident follow them back to Australia and affect their future travel plans? The unknown consequences seemed to grow more frightening with each passing second. Meanwhile, Sergeant Hayes remained at his post like a statue carved from stone, the coffee still dripping steadily from his stained uniform. His training had prepared him for many unusual situations, but being doused in coffee by a tourist's exploding backpack was definitely a first in his 8-year career. The liquid had begun to cool against his skin, creating an uncomfortable damp sensation that he was forced to ignore while maintaining his professional composure. The sergeant's internal thoughts were a complex mix of frustration and understanding. On one hand, his pristine uniform, a source of personal pride and military tradition, was now ruined. The red wool tunic would need professional cleaning, and depending on the extent of the staining, might need to be completely replaced. The process could take weeks and would involve extensive paperwork explaining the unusual circumstances of the damage. However, his years of experience had taught him to read people, and he could see that the young woman responsible for the accident was genuinely distressed. Her tears were real, and her frantic attempts to clean up the mess showed that this was clearly an accident born of enthusiasm, rather than malicious intent. He had encountered truly disrespectful tourists before, people who deliberately tried to distract guards or make them break character. But this was different. The ceremony continued its ancient rhythm around them, with the other guards maintaining their formations and routines despite the unusual distraction. Their training allowed them to adapt to unexpected situations, while preserving the dignity and continuity of the royal traditions they were sworn to protect. The show must go on, regardless of coffee stains or scattered souvenirs. Emma finally gathered the courage to look up at the guard she had accidentally assaulted with her beverage. Through her tears, she could see that despite the terrible staining of his uniform, his posture remained perfect and his expression unchanged. She wanted desperately to apologize, to somehow communicate her remorse and accidentally nature of what had happened, but she knew that guards were not supposed to interact with tourists during the ceremony. The approaching security officers wore expressions that revealed nothing about their intentions. They moved with the careful precision of professionals assessing a situation, taking in every detail of the scene before deciding on their response. Emma and Jake had no idea whether these officers would be sympathetic to their obvious distress, or if they would face serious consequences for disrupting such an important ceremonial event. One security officer, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying hair at his temples, arrived first at their position. He surveyed the scene quickly, taking note of the scattered souvenirs, the obvious distress of the young tourists, and the significant damage to Sergeant Hayes's uniform. His years of experience at the palace had shown him the difference between malicious troublemakers and innocent mistakes, and this situation clearly fell into the latter category. Jake found his voice first, his Australian accent thick with emotion as he attempted to explain what had happened. His words tumbled out in a rush, describing how they had come to London specifically to see the changing of the guard, how Emma's backpack had been overpacked with souvenirs, and how the coffee had been purchased with the innocent intention of staying alert for the ceremony they had looked forward to for months. The security officer listened patiently to Jake's explanation, his expression remaining neutral but not unkind. He had dealt with countless tourist incidents over the years, ranging from the trivial to the serious, and his trained eye could quickly assess the nature of any situation. The genuine distress of the young couple, combined with the obviously accidental nature of the incident, told him everything he needed to know about their intentions. Emma finally managed to speak through her tears, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the continuing ceremony. She apologized repeatedly, explaining how they had saved for months for this trip, how much this experience had meant to them, and how horrified she was that her clumsiness had potentially ruined something so important and traditional. Her words came out in broken sentences punctuated by sobs of embarrassment and regret. The security officer raised his hand gently to stop her flood of apologies, his gesture more reassuring than stern. He had seen enough to understand the situation completely, and while the incident was certainly unusual and regrettable, it was clearly the result of tourist enthusiasm gone wrong, rather than any deliberate disrespect or malicious behavior. The security officer's response surprised everyone within earshot. Instead of the stern reprimand or formal consequences that Emma and Jake had been dreading, he spoke in a calm, understanding voice that immediately began to ease their panic. He introduced himself as Officer Mitchell and explained that while the situation was certainly unusual, accidents do happen, especially when tourists are excited about experiencing British traditions for the first time. Officer Mitchell had worked at Buckingham Palace for over 15 years and had witnessed countless interactions between guards and visitors. He had developed an instinct for reading people and situations, and everything about Emma and Jake's behavior indicated genuine remorse and accidental causation rather than deliberate mischief. Their obvious distress, combined with their immediate attempts to clean up the mess, painted a clear picture of two young people who were mortified by their mistake. The ceremony was drawing to a close, which meant that Sergeant Hayes would soon be able to leave his post and address his ruined uniform. Officer Mitchell explained to the couple that once the formal proceedings ended in a few minutes, they would need to follow him to discuss the situation properly and determine what steps needed to be taken to resolve the incident appropriately. Emma wiped her tears and nodded eagerly, grateful that they weren't being immediately escorted away in handcuffs or banned from the palace grounds forever. Jake put a protective arm around her shoulders, trying to project confidence even though his own nerves were still frayed. They had traveled thousands of miles to experience this moment, and while it hadn't gone as planned, they were determined to face whatever consequences their accident had created. As the final notes of the ceremony echoed across the courtyard and the guards began their concluding formations, Emma couldn't take her eyes off Sergeant Hayes. The coffee stain had spread even further across his uniform, creating an abstract pattern of brown against the bright red wool. She noticed that despite the disaster that had befallen his pristine appearance, his posture never wavered and his concentration never broke. The crowd of tourists began to disperse as the formal ceremony concluded, many of them casting curious glances back at Emma, Jake, and the obviously stained guard. Some visitors approached Officer Mitchell to ask questions about what they had witnessed, but he politely directed them away, while maintaining his focus on the situation at hand. The incident had created enough spectacle without encouraging additional attention from curious onlookers. Finally, the moment that everyone had been waiting for arrived. The ceremony officially concluded, and Sergeant Hayes was dismissed from his ceremonial post. For the first time since the coffee had struck his uniform, he was free to move, speak, and react as a normal person rather than as a silent symbol of royal tradition and military discipline. The sergeant turned slowly to face Emma and Jake, his movement deliberate and controlled even now that he was off duty. Emma held her breath, expecting anger, frustration, or at the very least a strong reprimand for her carelessness. The moment stretched endlessly as she waited for his first words, knowing that whatever he said would determine whether this incident became a terrible memory or something they could eventually laugh about. Jake squeezed Emma's hand, offering what support he could while also preparing himself for whatever reaction the sergeant might have. They had disrupted his work, damaged his uniform, and created a scene during one of London's most famous and respected ceremonies. The guard had every right to be furious with them, and Jake was prepared to accept full responsibility for not helping Emma secure her backpack properly. When Sergeant Hayes finally spoke, his voice carried the crisp authority of his military training, but there was something else beneath the professional tone, something that neither Emma nor Jake had expected to hear. He looked directly at Emma, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since the incident began, and what she saw there wasn't anger or contempt, but rather a mixture of understanding and something that might have been amusement. The sergeant's first words were not what anyone anticipated. Instead of a rebuke or demand for compensation, he asked Emma if she was hurt when her backpack burst open. His concern for her well-being, despite being the victim of her accident, caught everyone present completely off guard. Officer Mitchell raised his eyebrows slightly, impressed by the sergeant's professionalism and character even in such an unusual situation. Emma was so surprised by his question that she almost forgot to answer. She quickly assured him that she wasn't injured, just incredibly embarrassed and sorry for what had happened to his beautiful uniform. Her voice trembled as she spoke, still overwhelmed by the kindness he was showing, despite having every reason to be angry with her. Sergeant Hayes nodded, and then did something that made everyone present pause in amazement. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, which he offered to Emma to help dry her tears. The gesture was so unexpected and gentlemanly that it seemed to belong in a different era, when such courtesies were common between strangers. The simple act spoke volumes about his character and the values he upheld both in uniform and as an individual. Officer Mitchell watched this interaction with growing respect for the sergeant. In his 15 years at the palace, he had seen guards react to various disruptions and challenges, but Sergeant Hayes's response to this situation was exemplary. Rather than focusing on his ruined uniform or the embarrassment of being doused with coffee in front of hundreds of tourists, his first concern was for the well-being of the person who had accidentally caused the problem. Jake found himself unexpectedly moved by the guard's kindness. He had expected consequences, anger, and possibly legal trouble, but instead they were encountering compassion and understanding. The sergeant's behavior was teaching them something profound about grace under pressure, and how to respond to accidents with dignity rather than blame. Emma accepted the handkerchief gratefully, using it to wipe away the last of her tears while marveling at the unexpected turn the situation had taken. The worst moment of her European adventure was slowly transforming into something else entirely. a lesson in human kindness and the difference between how people could choose to react to difficult situations. What happened next would stay with Emma and Jake for the rest of their lives, becoming a story they would tell countless times to friends, family, and anyone who would listen. Sergeant Hayes looked down at his coffee-stained uniform, then back at the terrified young couple, and did something that no one expected. He smiled. Not just a polite, professional smile, but a genuine, warm expression that transformed his entire appearance from stern military authority to approachable human being. The sergeant began to speak, and his words would echo in their memories forever. He explained that in his 8 years of Royal Guard duty, he had experienced many unusual situations, but never had anyone managed to redecorate his uniform quite so thoroughly with coffee. His tone was light, almost conversational, completely lacking the harsh reprimand that everyone had anticipated. Officer Mitchell found himself smiling too, amazed by the sergeant's ability to find humor in what could have been a very serious situation. Sergeant Hayes continued, telling them that accidents happen to everyone, and that their obvious distress and immediate attempts to make things right showed more character than many people display when things go wrong. He explained that the uniform, while expensive and symbolic, was ultimately just clothing that could be cleaned or replaced. What mattered more was how people responded to unexpected challenges, and their reaction had impressed him far more than their clumsiness had bothered him. Emma could hardly believe what she was hearing. The man whose uniform she had ruined was not only forgiving her, but was actually turning the incident into a positive learning experience. She had expected anger, demands for compensation, possibly even legal action, but instead she was receiving a lesson in grace and forgiveness from someone who had every right to be furious with her. The sergeant then shared something that made the entire situation even more remarkable. He told them that just that morning before the ceremony began, he had been feeling somewhat routine about his duties. The daily ceremonies, while important and meaningful, had begun to feel automatic after years of repetition. But their accident had reminded him why he loved his job, not just for the tradition and honor, but for the unexpected human connections that sometimes emerged from the most unlikely situations. Jake listened in amazement as the guard continued speaking. Sergeant Hayes explained that meeting tourists from around the world who traveled thousands of miles to witness British traditions was one of the most rewarding aspects of his service, even when those meetings didn't go exactly as planned. Their enthusiasm and obvious love for British culture, even expressed through an overpacked backpack and spilled coffee, reminded him of why these ceremonies were important in the first place. The sergeant's next words gave them both goosebumps and would become the centerpiece of their story for years to come. He looked directly at them and said that their accident had actually given him something precious, a story that would make his colleagues laugh for years, and a reminder that even the most formal traditions are ultimately about human connections and shared experiences. He thanked them for reminding him not to take himself too seriously and for bringing unexpected joy to what could have been just another routine day. Officer Mitchell had never witnessed anything quite like this interaction in all his years at the palace. He had seen guards maintain their composure under pressure, but Sergeant Hayes was demonstrating something far beyond professional duty, and he was showing genuine wisdom and emotional intelligence that transformed a potentially negative situation into something positive and meaningful for everyone
involved. Emma found her voice again,
asking if there was anything they could do to help with the cleaning or replacement costs for his uniform. The practical side of her mind was still worried about the financial implications of her accident, and she wanted to make sure they took responsibility for any expenses they had caused. Jake nodded in agreement, pulling out his wallet to show that they were prepared to cover whatever costs were necessary. Sergeant Hayes waved away their offer with another smile, explaining that the palace had procedures for handling uniform damage, and that accidents during ceremonies were actually covered by their standard protocols. He assured them that they wouldn't be responsible for any costs and that his uniform would be properly cleaned or replaced through official channels. His main concern was making sure they understood that mistakes happen and that they shouldn't let this incident ruin their London experience. The guard then surprised them even further by asking about their travels and what other London attractions they planned to visit. His genuine interest in their trip showed that he saw them as fellow human beings rather than just sources of problems or disruption. Emma and Jake found themselves chatting with him about their European adventure, their impressions of London, and their plans for the rest of their stay. As their conversation continued, other palace staff members began to take notice of the unusual scene. Instead of the expected formal incident report and consequences, they observed a friendly discussion between a coffee-stained guard and two apologetic tourists who seemed to be receiving life lessons rather than punishment. The sight was so unexpected that several staff members paused in their duties to witness this remarkable display of grace under pressure. Sergeant Hayes shared some recommendations for their remaining time in London, suggesting less crowded times to visit popular attractions and local restaurants that offered authentic British cuisine without the tourist markup. His insider knowledge transformed him from victim of their accident into helpful local guide, further cementing the positive turn their disastrous morning had taken. The most powerful moment came when the sergeant told them that he hoped they would remember this experience not as an embarrassing mistake, but as proof that most people are fundamentally kind and understanding when given the chance. He said that their immediate remorse and concern for his well-being had restored his faith in human nature and reminded him why he was proud to serve in a role that brought him into contact with people from around the world. The conclusion of their extraordinary encounter came with an invitation that neither Emma nor Jake could have imagined in their wildest dreams. After ensuring they understood that no formal action would be taken regarding the coffee incident, Sergeant Hayes made an unprecedented offer. He asked if they would be interested in a brief behind-the-scenes tour of areas normally off-limits to tourists, as a way of turning their embarrassing accident into a unique memory they could treasure forever. Officer Mitchell looked surprised by this suggestion, but quickly nodded his approval, recognizing that the sergeant's gesture would transform a potentially negative publicity incident into something positive for everyone involved. The palace occasionally offered special access to visitors in exceptional circumstances, and this situation certainly qualified as exceptional. The goodwill generated by such kindness would far outweigh any concerns about protocol. Emma and Jake exchanged incredulous glances, hardly believing that their worst travel disaster was about to become their greatest adventure. They had gone from expecting arrest or deportation to receiving a personal tour from the very guard whose uniform they had ruined. The transformation was so complete and unexpected that they wondered if they were dreaming or if this was really happening. Sergeant Hayes led them through areas of the palace grounds that few tourists ever see, explaining the history and significance of various buildings and traditions along the way. His coffee-stained uniform seemed almost like a badge of honor now, a symbol of the unusual friendship that had emerged from their accidental meeting. Other palace staff members they encountered smiled knowingly, having heard about the morning's events and the sergeant's remarkably gracious response. During their private tour, Sergeant Hayes shared stories about his experiences as a royal guard, the training required for the position, and the pride he felt in maintaining centuries-old traditions. He explained that the guard's famous stillness and silence weren't meant to be unfriendly, but rather to preserve the dignity and solemnity of royal ceremonies. His insights gave Emma and Jake a deeper appreciation for the dedication required to serve in such a role. The sergeant also revealed something that surprised them both. He had actually noticed Emma's enthusiasm during the ceremony and had been impressed by her obvious respect for the traditions she was witnessing, her careful attention to getting the perfect photograph, and her genuine excitement about the experience had caught his attention even before the coffee incident occurred. This revelation made Emma realize that her passion for the ceremony had been noticed and appreciated, even though it had led to disaster. As their tour continued, they encountered other guards and palace staff who had heard about the morning's events. Instead of disapproval or criticism, Emma and Jake were met with smiles, friendly greetings, and even a few good-natured jokes about coffee and backpacks. The palace community's response showed them that their accident had become a source of amusement rather than anger, and that sometimes the best stories come from the most unexpected moments. The tour concluded in a small courtyard, where Sergeant Hayes took time to answer their questions about royal traditions, palace history, and his experiences serving the monarchy. His willingness to share his knowledge and time with them felt like the ultimate act of forgiveness and friendship. What had started as their most embarrassing moment had become an educational and deeply meaningful experience they would never forget. Before parting ways, Sergeant Hayes made one final gesture that left them both speechless. He asked Officer Mitchell to take a photograph of the three of them together, with his coffee-stained uniform clearly visible in the picture. He explained that he wanted them to have proof that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best memories, and that they should never be afraid to laugh at themselves when things don't go as planned. As they prepared to leave, Emma returned the sergeant's handkerchief, but he insisted she keep it as a memento of their unusual meeting. He signed it with his name and the date, creating a unique souvenir that no amount of money could have purchased in any gift shop. The simple piece of cloth became one of their most treasured possessions from their European adventure. The impact of their encounter extended far beyond that single morning. Emma and Jake's story spread quickly through social media and travel forums, but instead of being mocked for their clumsiness, they were praised for their gracious handling of the situation and celebrated for sharing their story of human kindness. The incident became a viral sensation not because of the accident itself, but because of Sergeant Hayes's extraordinary response to it. Years later, Emma and Jake would return to London for their honeymoon, and their first stop was Buckingham Palace to watch the changing of the guard ceremony once again. This time, Emma's backpack was properly secured and contained no coffee, but they both carried the memory of their first visit and the lesson they had learned about grace, forgiveness, and the unexpected connections that can emerge from life's most embarrassing moments. Sergeant Hayes, who had since been promoted and transferred to other duties, became something of a legend among the palace guard for his handling of the coffee incident. His story was told to new recruits as an example of how to maintain dignity and professionalism while still showing humanity and compassion. The coffee-stained uniform was professionally cleaned and returned to service, but the memory of that morning continued to influence how he approached his duties and interactions with visitors there. Story became a testament to the power of choosing kindness over anger when faced with unexpected challenges. Emma and Jake learned that how people respond to accidents and mistakes reveals far more about their character than the mistakes themselves. Sergeant Hayes taught them that true strength comes not from never making errors, but from how gracefully we handle the errors of others. The ripple effects of their encounter continued for months afterward. Emma started a travel blog dedicated to sharing stories of unexpected kindness from strangers around the world, inspired by the sergeant's example. Jake changed his career path after returning to Australia, deciding to pursue work in hospitality and tourism, where he could help create positive experiences for travelers, just as Sergeant Hayes had done for them. The handkerchief became a family heirloom, carefully preserved and displayed in their home as a reminder that the most meaningful travel memories often come from unplanned moments rather than perfectly executed itineraries. Whenever friends or family members shared their own travel disasters, Emma and Jake would tell their London story, always emphasizing how one person's choice to respond with grace instead of anger had transformed their worst moment into their best memory. Sergeant Hayes occasionally received letters from tourists around the world who had heard their story and wanted to thank him for representing the best of British hospitality and character. His supervisors took note of these commendations, recognizing that his handling of the coffee incident had generated more positive publicity for the palace than any formal ceremony could have achieved. The incident also led to some practical changes at the palace. Tourist information now included gentle reminders about securing personal belongings during ceremonies, and guards received updated training on handling accidental disruptions with patience and understanding. These changes ensured that future accidents would be handled with the same grace that Sergeant Hayes had demonstrated. Most importantly, their story spread far beyond London's tourist circles, becoming an example used in customer service training programs, conflict resolution workshops, and even school lessons about empathy and forgiveness. The simple act of choosing understanding over anger had created a teaching moment that would influence countless other interactions between strangers. Around the world, Emma and Jake's coffee disaster at Buckingham Palace became more than just a funny travel story. It became proof that even in our most embarrassing moments, we can encounter extraordinary kindness from unexpected sources. Their experience reminded everyone who heard it that the world is full of good people waiting to surprise us with their compassion, if we're brave enough to see past our own mistakes and accept their grace.